Everyone. In the hustle and bustle of daily life, are you taking care of your mental health? In today's world, the importance of mental health is widely recognized, to the point where it's not uncommon for workplaces to have industrial counselors. Depression is now often referred to as a cold of the mind, a condition that anyone could develop at any time. If you visit a modern psychiatric hospital, you can receive appropriate treatments tailored to each case, such as counseling or medication. However, did you know that about 100 years ago in American psychiatric hospitals, unimaginable and inhumane practices were taking place? At that time, what could only be described as acts of torture were carried out in the name of treatment. Furthermore, to prevent patients from escaping, every door was locked, and the windows were secured with sturdy iron bars. It was a confined and hopeless world. What kind of environment did those hospitals have back then? And what horrifying practices were carried out there? Let's take a look into the psychiatric hospitals of that era. Welcome to the terrifying world of psychiatric hospitals, where not a shred of hope could be found. Until the 1960s, people in the United States were forcibly hospitalized, regardless of whether they had a mental illness. One of the factors that made this possible was the laws in place at the time. There were laws that allowed individuals to be hospitalized at the request of their families, even without medical evidence or proof of a mental illness. For example, in 1860, a certain woman was confined to a mental hospital for 3 years. The reason for her hospitalization was a claim by her husband that her religious beliefs differed from his. Such unjust commitments were legally permitted at the time. One reason for the prevalence of such unwarranted hospitalizations was that admitting family members to mental hospitals was not only advantageous for the families but also beneficial for the hospitals. And the main benefit? Money. At the time, many hospitals were barely able to stay operational, with revenue from wealthy clients. Admitting the relatives of affluent patrons became a significant source of profit for these hospitals. Naturally, there was no reason for the hospitals to refuse admissions. In other words, sending someone to a mental hospital, regardless of whether they had a mental illness, was a mutually beneficial and perfectly legal arrangement for both families and hospitals. Because of this, families used mental hospitals as convenient facilities to keep troublesome relatives out of the way. As a result, patients were often hospitalized for extended periods. By 1904, the majority of patients were long-term residents, with only about 30% of admissions lasting less than a year. The idea of being confined and isolated in a mental hospital, despite not having any mental health issues, is horrifying enough. But the fact that such confinement was legally sanctioned adds an unimaginable layer of despair for those who were committed. Under these circumstances, it's easy to imagine that many patients desperately wanted to escape. To prevent such attempts, hospitals implemented strict security measures. These facilities effectively became prisons in all but name. Before long, rumors began to circulate that acts akin to torture were taking place within mental hospitals. However, entering these closed institutions to verify such claims was no simple task. Amid this, a journalist attempted an undercover investigation in 1887 to expose the reality of these mental hospitals. Her name was nelliebly. She reported the results of her investigation as follows. Patients are treated like prisoners. Every door in the building is locked. The windows are secured with sturdy iron bars, and 300 women are confined within the facility. They are treated like livestock, having their hair pulled out, being locked in solitary confinement, and being treated as less than human by the doctors. Her accounts made it clear just how abnormal the conditions inside the hospital were. So, what about the actual treatments? Unfortunately, at the time, hospitals implemented shocking and extreme treatments. For example, in the treatment of syphilis. Before the advent of antibiotics, they were desperately searching for ways to combat syphilis. After much deliberation, they finally invented a groundbreaking treatment. This was malaria therapy. The treatment was based on the theory that syphilis could be eradicated by the fever caused by malaria. It involved injecting malaria parasites into patients. Starting in 1900, when doctors at the Oregon State Hospital administered malaria therapy to syphilis patients, this treatment became widely used in mental hospitals. But was it effective, considering its widespread adoption? According to research, about half of the patients showed improvements in syphilis symptoms after being infected with malaria. It's surprising that it actually had some effect. However, the story doesn't end with the improvement of syphilis symptoms. Patients who received this treatment inevitably became infected with malaria, and as a result, about 15% of them reportedly died. Such dangerous treatments were routinely performed in mental hospitals at the time. That said, what I've just described was a treatment for infectious diseases. One might hope that treatments for mental illnesses were gentler, but as you may have guessed, this was not the case. When we think of psychiatric care, counseling or medication may come to mind. However, the treatments of the time were nothing of the sort. They were much more physical in nature. For example, in early 19th century England, a wheel designed to spin patients at high speeds was used as a form of treatment. They also tried to restore sanity by applying physical stimuli, such as pressing heated irons against patients' skin to brand them. By the 1930s, terrifying experiments disguised as treatments began, including the infamous lobotomy and electroshock therapy. Who would willingly subject themselves to such treatments? These mental hospitals, where various shock therapies were performed, did not confine their admissions to adults. Children were also admitted as patients. Between 1854 and 1900, hundreds of children under the age of 16 were evaluated to determine whether they needed treatment. The evaluations were based on factors such as violent tendencies or the risk of suicide, resulting in 200 children being admitted. The same treatments were administered to these children as to the adult patients. The children admitted not only lost contact with their families, but were treated the same as adults. Many of them never left the hospital alive. These inhumane treatments for both adults and children began on the very first day of admission. For example, at the Oregon State Hospital, upon admission, patients were first required to empty their pockets, strip off their clothes, and take a bath. Immediately afterward, a physical examination, blood tests, and a syphilis test were conducted. If they were lucky, this marked the end of their first day. However, some patients were left alone in rooms with barred windows on their very first day. Thus, from the moment they were admitted, patients faced a harsh initiation into life at the mental hospital. After the daytime treatments and examinations were completed, night fell in the mental hospital, just as it did in the outside world. One might hope that the night would at least bring some peace. But such a hope was not fulfilled here. This was because mental hospitals at the time were very simple in design, allowing voices to echo throughout the facility. And this was a mental hospital. At night, screams and cries, wishing for death could be heard from the rooms all around. What awaited patients was a dark, hellish night. Even if one did not suffer from a mental illness, it was an environment where one could easily lose their sanity. By the late 19th century, reforms in the living conditions of mental hospitals began to take shape. The reformers advocated for two main points. The first was the construction of more hospitals. This proposal was accepted in many states, and by the 1870s, most states had established mental hospitals. The second point was to create beautiful buildings and well-maintained grounds. As a result, mental hospitals transformed into grand structures. featuring gardens and lawns where patients could stroll. The once prison-like facilities evolved into magnificent buildings. And, astonishingly, mental hospitals became popular tourist destinations. In fact, mental hospital tourism was one of the popular leisure activities. In the latter half of the 19th century, one guidebook recommended the Bloomingdale Asylum as a must-visit spot among city asylums, known for its spacious grounds and beautiful views. With such impressive buildings, one might assume that the patients' lives also improved. However, that was not the case. At that time, the concept of mental illness was vague, making it difficult to provide appropriate treatments. So, how did doctors of the time determine whether someone was suffering from a mental illness? According to historical records, they believed that a variety of factors could cause mental abnormalities. The records list reasons why doctors deemed hospitalization necessary. Frank Campbell. Mental abnormalities caused by malaria-induced fever. William Byrne. Head trauma from falling off a horse. Jane de Passy. Mental abnormalities due to chronic alcohol intoxication. Henry Schreiber. Born a dork. As seen above, doctors of the time diagnosed mental abnormalities for a wide range of reasons, including high fever, head injuries, and even low intelligence. It seems they labeled anything they didn't fully understand as a mental illness. The understanding of mental illness at the time was so superficial that it's no surprise they couldn't provide appropriate treatments. Mental hospitals, where patients were strictly controlled to prevent escapes and subjected to long-term confinement. For reasons unimaginable to us today, many people were admitted, and a variety of horrifying treatments were performed. It's chilling to imagine what it would have been like to be born in that era. The world's history is still shrouded in mystery. Let's continue our journey to uncover the secrets of the world together. Until we meet again on our next adventure. Thank you for watching.